Hello and thanks for visiting our website, rebuilderinabox.com. Today we're going to learn how to rebuild the three different types of Denso alternators, formerly known as Nippon Denso. Their most popular application is on Dodge trucks and Jeep. This is the version that we call the Nippon Denso Post, because of the two terminals here that have the nuts on them that hold the wires on. This is the Nippon Denso Circle, because of the circle right here where the wires plug in. This is the Denso pin kit. It's an oval shaped plug with the two small pins that are down inside the plug. First we need to take off the battery post nut and battery post insulator with a 12mm socket deep well. Next we're going to take off these three nuts and the ground screw with a 5/16. After this step, we're ready to pry up on the tin cover around the edges. Just take a screwdriver and start prying it up. Now with the cover off, we need to make a decision if you're going to simply repair your alternator by installing just the terminal block and the brush holder assembly, or if you're going to do a full rebuild. The decision will be based on mainly if you want to replace your bearings or not. You can tell if your bearings are good or not by holding the alternator in the palm of your hand and spinning the pulley. If you don't feel any vibration in your left hand, then your bearings are good and you can probably get away with just a repair. If you spin the pulley and you feel a vibration or a roughness in the bearings, then you need new bearings. Going on with just a repair or complete rebuild, you have to take this Phillips head, and this one over here out. There's a Phillips head here and here, and quite often there's quite a bit of rust and corrosion on those two down in there, and that's why we supply the new terminal block, because these two can run into a lot of trouble getting those loose. But the only ones that you have to get out is this one, and this one, the three yellow ones. Looking closely at where the brushes ride on the rotor slip ring, at this time we have in electrical diagnosis what we call the aha moment, where you can say, aha, this was my problem, or it wasn't. You can see where the brush was riding on this bottom one, where it's a little bit darker than the top one. That's a dead giveaway that that brush was failing, and you'll know that when you put new brushes on it, that's going to fix your problem. You have to make sure before you go ahead with the repair, though, that it's not completely worn through. And also you want to take a piece of sandpaper and spin the pulley on the bottom so that you can get access all the way around and clean all the arcs out of it. Like I said, though, if you're very unlucky, and it's not common that these would be worn clear through, then you have to order a new rotor slip ring. For example, this one here, you can see right how much is gone, and that's just about on the borderline to where you would actually be on the fence that you would be able to get away with reusing it or not. Anything deeper than that is definitely not reusable, but as long as it's just about here, or hopefully a little less than that, like this one, should be able to get away with reusing it as long as you clean out the arc real good. Take a piece of sandpaper or some Scotch-Brite and get rid of all the arc that's there. As long as you can still see copper, it's considered reusable. Moving along with the full rebuild, the next thing we have to do is take the rectifier assembly off. This is where all the diodes are, and it's held on by 4 Phillips head screws. Here you see one on the side. Take all 4 of those out. The 4 screws are out. Just pull the rectifier off. Then you'll see the 4 rubber insulators. These have a slant on them, and the slant goes towards the inside. Also, there's a rubber grommet, dust cover. Then you'll notice the 4 5/16 head nuts that hold the frames together. Remove those. For the pulley removal, take a 1/2 inch impact and a 22 millimeter. Hold on to the pulley with a rag. Now we're getting ready to separate the 2 halves, and quite often there's a lot of corrosion. Hold on to the bottom half and take a hammer and tap it back and forth just to break things loose a little bit. Then what we're going to do is use the back of the vise as leverage. Hold the alternator with both hands by the bottom and tap down. Now we're going to put the rotor and rear plate assembly in the vise. The vise is opened up enough so that the rear plate sets on the vise, but the rotor comes down through. And the bottom of the shaft has to be away from the bellows, from the bottom of the vise, because we're going to drive it out. When you look down on the shaft, you'll see that in the very center is a metal portion, and on the outer edge is the plastic. So when you drive this out, be sure that your center punch is resting on the center of the shaft. All you really need is an ordinary center punch and a hammer. Right at this point, we have 2 possibilities or 2 scenarios. The first one is that the bearing stayed in the rear plate after you pounded the rotor out. In this case, we're going to use a 13 millimeter socket to set down in there and drive the rear bearing out. There's a thrust washer in here, like a heat sink. Go ahead and damage that because we won't be reusing it. The other scenario is that the bearing stayed on the shaft and the bearing and rotor all fell out of the rear plate as we pounded it out with the center punch. So what we need to do is get the rear bearing off of the shaft. You'll notice that there's epoxy in two areas 180 degrees apart. Put one of those towards you. Clamp the shaft in a vise and take two pry bars. Stick them in underneath, and you have to bend two of the fans down. Then pry up to get the bearing off. Then you can take a pair of needle nose pliers and bend the fans back where they go. Then you'll notice the 4 screws holding the bearing cover down inside. Those are 7mm or Phillips. Remove those and take the bearing cover off. Then we need to set the front plate in the vise again in order to drive out the front bearing. You can set a 3/4 socket on top of that and knock it out with a hammer, going straight down. Next step is to put the drive-in bearing in, set it down inside the housing, and we're going to use a common 6" by 1/4" extension. And what you want to do is tap it down in there by hitting only on the outer race. And just go around in a circle and work it down in there, looking at the side view so that it goes in there straight. When you see a little bit of extra on one side, then tap down in that side, because it'll only go in perfectly straight. But as you're tapping it in, don't tap on the middle race. Tap only on the outer edge. What we have to do now is take a 15mm socket, and we need to get the rear bearing back on this plate. First, we're going to do a test and make sure that the socket goes all the way down onto the shaft without catching on the slip ring, because the copper portions we don't want to do any damage whatsoever to. For this application, we want to press or tap only on the inner race of the bearing. When we're pushing a bearing onto a shaft, you only tap on the inner race. When you're pushing it into a plate where it's contained on the outside, you only tap on the outer race. Once again, this is a 15mm deep well. Starting to put her back together now. Set the rotor down in there. Tap it down in with the wooden part of the hammer handle. Then set the plate on, line up the bearing, and line up all of the leads in the stator windings so that they come up in the center of the holes that are provided. We've taken the pulley and set it on top of the 3 studs, and you can use that to tap the rear plate back down on, or you can just take a 15/16 deep well. And then once you see the studs start to appear up through the top so that there's enough of them there to get the nuts on, put the 4 nuts on and use them to draw it completely back together. So we have the 4 nuts tightened back down, and this is the place where we want to flip it over and do what we call a spin check. Hold it in your hand and spin the rotor with your other hand. What you're checking for is to make sure that there's no resistance. You can hear a little bit of noise, maybe a little rust, or just a little place where everything didn't get back out of the way again because there's only a tiny amount of clearance between the rotor and the stator windings. So it would be common to have a little bit of a noise going on in there, but you don't want a major foul up like the one of the fans hitting and getting stuck. When you put it on the car, if there's just a little bit of a hit, it'll wear itself out. You have to make sure that the leads, take a screwdriver and go in through the side and make sure that none of the leads, these 4 stator leads, are rubbing on the rotor. Then you can put the grommets back in, and remember that the slant goes away from the rotor. The longest part goes on the outside diameter. Then set the rectifier back down on the studs and put the Phillips bolts, the 4 Phillips leads, through. Okay, so everything's bolted back together, the rectifier's back in place, and the 4 Phillips screws are screwed back in, which connect the stator leads to the rectifier. We can put the dust cover back in, the grommet. And this is one very important step here. Take a piece of sandpaper or a wire toothbrush and clean this area right here, these 2 grounds, and pay particular close attention to clean this right here and that, front and back. Then you can take a little bit of either dielectric grease or white lithium and spread it in the areas you just cleaned. Here, these 2, and here. Now this is where you would pick up again with the video if you were just doing a repair. If you didn't want to do all that bearing work. You take the 2 parts that came in the kit, put them together like that. Then we're going to put the screws in here, the short Phillips screw here and here. Then we're going to take a penknife or an ordinary blade, stick it down in, and pull the brushes back. So after we already put this one and this one in, we've got 3 more to go. The 2 long ones here and here, and the 1 short one right there. You might have to take an awl or something pointy like this and line that one up, but these are the 2, there's only 3 to go, the 2 long ones and the short one. And the way we got this down on here was because the knife was holding the brushes back. Let's just take a minute and make sure that everything is tight with our Phillips screwdriver. There's 9 of them to check. The 4 that hold the rectifier on, the 4 that hold the terminal block to the brush holder assembly, and the 1 that holds the brush holder assembly terminal block to the rectifier. So there's 9 places altogether. Just make sure everything's nice and tight. Then we put the dust cover back on, And all there is left to do is put the 3 5/16 nuts on, put the ground strap and screw in, and then tighten those down. When you put the battery insulator back on, you'll notice that there's a peg right here that goes down in the hole. Before you put the last nut back on the battery stud, make sure that that nut is nice and clean if you don't have a new one, because that's a contact area. So that's going to go back on there. And then you're done. If you didn't realize it by now, there is no voltage regulator. The voltage regulator is in the computer. You may want to take your unit to the local parts store if it's labor intensive to put on, and have them spin check it for you. If you do, sometimes it's a good idea to supervise, because the person that works there may or may not know the proper hookups. Actually, it's very simple, and all 3 of these kits are the same. The pin and the post and the circle have basically the same diagram. There's 2 posts here, and there's 2 spades on the circle kit, and there's 2 pins on the pin kit. And basically all you do is just very simply put hot to one and ground the other. Doesn't matter which one. Same way with on the circle, there's 2 spades. You put 12 volts to one and ground the other one. Same way with the pin. To do a voltage regulator bypass, this is the field circuit, because we remember that it goes in and goes through the brushes and goes through the rotor and then comes back out. So you can put hot and ground to either one. The alternator doesn't care. That causes full field, and then you're going to read the amperage output. Of course, you have to have the battery hooked up and a ground so that the rectifier has somewhere to put output. As the alternator spins up, I'm going to flick the switch and put juice to the one terminal. And you'll see the only thing that we're interested in really at this point is amperage. This is a self-adjusting fluke, and it's hooked up to a shunt, so it's going to read around 130. It says 130, but it's because of our setup that it does that. So that means it's good. It's ready to install.